So, hello everyone, I'm Valeria Giffen with the JLA, and today we will be interviewing Patrick Lewis. So, Patrick, if before we kind of get into the article summary, would you just be able to introduce yourself to the audience, who you are and where you're at and what kinds of research you enjoy doing?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me. My name is Patrick Lewis. As you said, I'm an assistant professor at Concordia University in Montreal, where I teach, among other things, linguistic anthropology, and my training has been in linguistic anthropology. Most of my research has been in Turkey and Kurdistan, where I've looked at questions of language activism, higher education, public formation, and currently, I'm starting a new project on international students in Turkey, in which language is also going to play a kind of major role.
That's very cool. And that leads us perfectly. You're talking about you've done work about Turkey and international students. So maybe you could give us a brief summary for a public audience of the article that you had published to the JLA.
Sure, absolutely. So the article kind of makes two parallel arguments, although related. The first looks at a registerment of standard language among Kurdish-speaking communities in contemporary Turkey, as evidenced by the kind of growing, albeit varying degrees of uptake and use of standard linguistic repertoires among Kurdish-speaking populations. And this is particularly the case in writing. It's like social media and television, also a growing publishing industry. But you also see it in spoken Kurdish as well. And so by extension, it concerns the kind of century-old project by Kurdish activists and educators to standardize Kurmanji Kurdish, which is the kind of variety of the primary variety, I should say, of Kurdish spoken by Kurdish speakers in Turkey, or North Kurdistan, as many Kurds would prefer to call it. Um, and so it kind of also addresses itself and draws from the history and the kind of contemporary linguistic situation in Kurdistan around Kurdish language activism and education and media. And so one of the observations I make is that um, the increasing success of the standardization project is remarkable compared to kind of other nation state standardization efforts that we observe because of not only the lack of state support, but often the open state opposition to Kurdish language education, and then the kind of corresponding lack of educational institutions like schools, where many people conventionally learn to produce standard language. And so rather, it's been more of a result of a bottom-up collaborative effort among Kurdish publics, albeit organized in some ways by Kurdish activists and publishers and intellectuals. And it's involved television and then even more so digital media and social media in particular. And so it's probably important to kind of qualify this success a little bit because there is a lot of concern in Turkey now around the decline of Kurdish speakers relative to Turkish speakers, speakers of other languages as well. And this is a process that's been going on essentially since the formation of the Turkish Republic. And it's kind of hard to measure. There's certainly evidence for this decline, like anecdotal, but also survey evidence. But there's also evidence of growing consumption of Kurdish text, right? Both in like the physical media of books and newspapers, which is historically quite controlled, but which has become more prevalent in recent years. And also on places like social media. So we do see it kind of among people who are writing Kurdish, and also among those who are speaking it, we're seeing a kind of growing adoption of standardized linguistic repertoires. That said, and this is kind of where I get into the kind of particulars of my intervention, right? I argue that the success of this standardization, as evidenced by kind of growing use, does not mean that all Kurdish speakers value standard language equally or necessarily for the same reasons. And so this kind of leads me to a related argument, which I think talks or intervenes in larger discussions about the relationship between Kurdish language, activism, and Kurdish nationalism and ideas of Kurdish nationhood. And the intervention I make is that for a growing number of Kurdish intellectuals and educators, standard language functions less as a tool to kind of promote national linguistic homogeneity, right, to kind of reduce linguistic differences, and actually more as a tool through which they acknowledge and negotiate, and then also in many cases celebrate social differences among Kurds, including linguistic differences. And so there's also an argument about the kind of the changing in different ways that Kurdish language activists and educators and writers understand the relationship between language and nationhood. And so the second part of this whole article, the second related argument that I kind of develop in parallel, concerns the role of language humor in process of language enregistrement more generally. So one piece of evidence that I offer for the kind of growing enregistrement of standard Kurdish in Turkey is the growth in the number of jokes Kurds make about it, both like in everyday interactions amongst themselves, but also on social media and other forms of mass media. Um, and I argue that what's interesting about language jokes is that they tend to draw attention to linguistic features, whether they be standard language or really any kind of unregistered features of language, by thematizing them in ways that make them more available to recognition, and therefore like more available to conscious awareness. And by extension, these jokes actually have the kind of effect of contributing to people's linguistic awareness, right? Of and registered features of language. So what aspects of vocabulary or grammar or pronunciation is associated with standard language is kind of reproduced in these jokes. And what's interesting is this is true even when the jokes are making fun of standard language. So it seems a bit counterintuitive. But one of the points that I make towards the end is that much more kind of detrimental to a standardization effort would be if no one was talking about it, right? So the very fact that people are interested in invoking standard language in these jokes, even if they kind of dismiss them or to make fun of the people that are using them in certain contexts, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are rejecting standard language. Actually, the opposite. It means that people are becoming more aware of it. They're kind of encountering it more and more in their everyday life. And here I also make an argument about enregistrement, and I think language humor helps us see this as this kind of double process that involves both recognition and evaluation. And these are related, right? I mean, the kind of recognition of meaningful difference kind of presupposes there's some meaning or kind of something to be evaluated there to begin with, and then entails the kind of evaluation that comes from it. But it's more to say that the features through which standard language is recognized in any one instance might be shared, right, through multiple people in common, but they may be evaluating those differences differently, or they may be kind of ascribing different values to it. Which again is not to say that people are rejecting standard language, right? But there's an argument about when standard language should be used, how it should be used, the authority that it kind of carries with it in different contexts, and by extension, the authority of other non-standard kinds of Kurdish. So that's kind of the overview of the two pieces of the argument.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect summary. I almost want to urge people to watch the interview first and read the article because I feel like you give a really good background of like the main components of the article. And me personally, I was interested in all of it. Frankly, to be honest with you, I didn't have much background in the situation for the Kurdish peoples, and so now I read your article and I did a little research myself. So I was just really curious and intrigued by the humoristic component because as you're saying, there's sort of there has to be a recognition and then an evaluation. And I think that it almost allows for people to talk about it in a way that might not seem so serious. It's almost like a vehicle to, oh, that's so funny that we recognize what this is about. And then that allows for maybe a more serious conversation that maybe otherwise couldn't have taken place. So I really am very curious about the humor component of the research. I thought that was really interesting reading about that.
Yeah, and I guess one thing, it's a good question and good point too. And I think one thing I would maybe add that I forgot to mention earlier is I think humor is interesting not only because of like the kind of unique ideological and linguistic features that structure language jokes, and I won't get into those details here just because I think it's easier to see it in an article with the kind of empirical evidence I'm drawing on. But that humor, and there has been this kind of growth along with social media and television of comedic genres in Kurdistan over the past couple decades, um, allows for people to kind of discuss sensitive issues or to kind of express alternative views in ways that are both funny, but ways that might not always be possible in kind of more, I hesitate to use the word serious, right? But kind of restricted political discourses or even educational or activist spaces. Although I do describe the way that people sometimes use humor even in these spaces to kind of make points that might be offensive or seem more aggressive in other kinds of contexts, but allow people to kind of express themselves and yeah, in ways that might not be possible otherwise. So I think yeah, that this is also an important dimension of the humor.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through this wonderful article. I urge people to go check it out. We have a summary published as well that I hope did justice to your wonderful work. Patrick, before I let you go, if anybody were more interested or curious about your work, your research, and they really wanted to reach out to you, is there an email or anywhere people can reach you
Sure,
at?
absolutely. So, if people search Patrick Lewis Concordia, you can find my faculty page under the Sociology and Anthropology Department's website. Or if you want to email me directly, you can reach me at patrick.lewis@concordia.ca.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, Patrick.